Hi BookTube, it's Amy. You might recall in my Friday Reads that I mentioned Caresse Crosby's autobiography, The Passionate Years. And I did indeed read this on Saturday and I loved it. It was the immersive experience that I was looking for. Now, it wasn't a philosophical autobiography. There was nothing earth-shattering in it, but overall it was an enjoyable look into the life of Caresse Crosby, and she really was a remarkable woman for her time. She was married 3 times over the course of her life, and she actually got a divorce from her first husband in the 1920s, which absolutely scandalized people. So she grew up in New York. She was a wealthy socialite. She probably wouldn't have described herself as wealthy, but you can tell it's quite evident from her anecdotes that she was wealthy and she was up in that, high New York society. I guess there was a society register back in the day, perhaps there still is, but her family's name was down there. And she went to all these balls and she had a coming out, and she was, high up enough in the social ladder that she was actually presented at court. So presented to the king at the time. And she had this big, extravagant dress that she describes, made for the occasion, and it was, I guess, a nerve-wracking occasion for her because she had to be left by her relative at the door, and just to drop her off, he had to get into full evening dress, just to drive her up to the gates. And then she went alone to be presented. So she was already someone of high social standing. The First World War comes along and she marries her childhood sweetheart, this young man, Dick, that she had been engaged to since the age of 14. They had met while their families were vacationing at some ritzy cottages somewhere. They're described as cottages, but they're the sort of cottages where everybody has like their own couple of acres or whatever around the lake, and there are dwellings for the servants while you're there. So it was very much that sort of camping cottage experience, not what most of us would think of as going to the cottage. And so she had been engaged to this boy Dick, and when they both grew up, she decided that she was going to marry him, and she did. She had a couple of kids. Married life wasn't too intolerable, and then he came back from the war, suffering from the experiences that he had had over there, and his mental health was not good. He had taken up drinking, and then she catches sight of Harry, a young man in the neighborhood who's her junior. In fact, she first experiences a social situation with him when she is asked by his mother to be the chaperone for a group of young people. So he is 21 or 22 and she is, I think, 28, and a married woman with children, and so she is asked to go along to this party with these young people to be a chaperone. And Harry immediately takes a shine to her, and they may or may not, it's a little bit blurred, they may or may not engage in an extramarital affair where she's still married to Dick. And she decides to divorce Dick. He's very open to it. And off she goes to Europe with her new husband, Harry, and they settle in Paris, where they found their own printing company. Harry is a writer, he is a poet. Caresse herself takes up poetry, and it's actually at this era in her life where she chooses the name Caresse. She was actually born Mary, and so she discards that name and decides to be Caresse Crosby. Now you can imagine when she tells her family, they are quite scandalized that she would ask to be called Caresse, because perhaps that's not too odd of a name nowadays, but at the time, it definitely would have been a highly sexualized name to say that you're going to call yourself Caresse Crosby. And so she chooses this new name, goes to this new life in Paris, and tries her own hand at writing and poetry. And so they found this publishing company, this printing press, and they begin to publish. And they become quite well known in Paris, publishing the likes of Joyce and D.H. Lawrence. And she has an overall fascinating several years in Paris. She retreats to the States when the Second World War rolls around, but claims that she was one of the first to come back in 1945 after the occupation ended. Now, we actually see relatively little of the the famous people that are touted on the back of here. We see a bit of her own interactions with Joyce and D.H. Lawrence and Salvador Dali and Picasso, but that's not what this book is about. It's largely about her own experiences and, if you will, her own impulses. She seems to be a very impulsive person. She says throughout, "I love to say yes." And on several occasions, she recounts how she and her husband purchased property on a whim or rented an apartment on a whim. There's one particular story where they have essentially bribed the landlord into letting them rent a particular apartment for a pretty high price, and then on their way out they pass another apartment which is absolutely perfect, and so just by chance it's for rent as well, and so impulsively they immediately take this apartment and go back to the other place that they spent hours bribing this guy to get, and tell him no, we don't want that anymore, and they get out of it with like a mere 6 months rent back, which I can't even imagine having 6 months rent to just throw away. And then there's another occasion where she goes to a realtor and views this farmhouse, this farm estate on a whim, and thinks it's absolutely perfect. And she puts down the down payment and signs the papers before her husband, her third husband in this case, gets a look at it. And her third husband, I believe his name is Bert. We don't see very much of him. He doesn't appear until the last few pages of the autobiography. But her third husband she married after the death of her second husband, Harry. It's actually quite tragic, and I don't want to call it interesting, but heartbreaking in a way to see the way that she glosses over his death. She mentioned that he perhaps wasn't doing so well in terms of his mental health. He suggested at one point that they both leap off the balcony, and she says, "Why would we do that? We have so much to live for." And then he disappears and she can't find him anywhere, and then they find him dead because he indeed committed suicide, but he was quite young. And so that is how she loses the love of her life, and she says that she's never going to marry again, but then she does indeed fall in love and marry again. So it was quite an enjoyable read, especially as I knew nothing about Caresse Crosby. This is interesting as well. She claims to have invented the brassiere. So this is her patent that she registered with the U.S. Patent Office in 1914, and She says she had gotten tired of wearing form-fitting corsets. She wasn't able to breathe or dance well in them. And so one evening she took 2 of her handkerchiefs and had her maid sew them together to create what she described as the backless brassiere. And she actually tried to popularize it and sell it herself. She engaged a sweatshop to do that, but wasn't really able to sell any of them. And so she sort of gave up, and she later sold it to a well-known lingerie company for $1,500. The design, the patent, all of it. And of course, they went on to make probably the equivalent of millions of dollars from her invention. But of course, she is one of several people who claim to have invented the bra. So take it what you will, she did patent a certain design. Overall, an interesting book, something I would recommend picking up if you happen to stumble across it. But overall, an immersive experience, an enjoyable read, something I'm glad I picked up.